Welcome to How to Clinical Research. I'm Eric Lambert, and today we have a caller that's a viewer of the channel, and she is looking for help to become a CRA. She has a job interview lined up already with a CRO in Texas, but she wants to be. This call is to really help her get prepared in conducting this interview, but also teaching her a little bit about what the role is, what to expect during this interview. And if pursuing the CRA role first is really the best choice, or maybe she should become a CTA first and then become a CRA, so that she can kind of build the proper experience and be better suited to perform, better for the CRA role. So, anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. If you want to be a part of the channel like this, if you want to call in, ask questions, be sure to leave a comment down below. Or you can message me directly on social media. My Instagram is linked down below in the description. So anyways, let's get into it, and I hope you guys enjoy. So just for the viewers, do you want to go over kind of what you have coming up in terms of your job interview and any questions or concerns that you have with that?
Yes, the interview is for the clinical research associate position, and I just needed some navigation with how to utilize my experience towards this interview.
Gotcha. So now this is with the CRO. So I think it's good for you to understand first what it is that a CRA does, and you have kind of different kinds of CRAs. So for instance, you can have a CRA at a sponsor, and you can have a CRA at a CRO. The CRA at the sponsor, they kind of split it up into potentially two different roles, and they might do it the same thing at the CRO. So for instance, at the sponsor, the CRA might be a in-house CRA. This is where they do a lot of the administrative work, kind of remote work in terms of managing the site. Then they also have the monitor role. And monitors many times are called CRAs and vice versa. But monitors are really kind of specific towards going to sites and monitoring them in terms of conducting SIVs, PSVs, different monitoring visits, providing those monitoring reports, and so forth. The in-house team does, like I said, the administrative work. So they'll work with the sites in terms of making sure patients are enrolled correctly, making sure that they have all the trainings, certificates, different IRB approvals, and so forth that are needed for each site to be in compliance with FDA and sponsor regulations, and as well as in line with the protocol. And if any protocol deviations come about or any issues, the in-house team is really there to resolve those issues. Now, at a CRO, it's a little bit different. So the CRO, the CRA will, many times, it's really based on billable hours. So for instance, the CRO is contracted by the sponsor to do, it could really be anything. So a lot of times the sponsors will maybe contact a CRO for just the monitoring aspect. So the CRO will now provide the monitors for the sites, which could be the CRA, right? So I think it's really important because every company is going to use the CRAs maybe a little bit different, especially at a CRO, depending on the contracts and business relationships that they have with the sponsors, because they all have different requirements and expectations by the sponsors that they're working with. So the job might differ a little bit in terms of responsibilities. So for instance, the CRO might use you as both an in-house and a monitor person, right? So you might be doing both roles. Or they might just put you into purely as a in-house person, so that you can just work remotely for the sponsor. If the sponsor doesn't have their own in-house team, or like I said, they can use you purely for the monitoring. So I think that's a really important question to ask when you go to this job interview, is just ask, if you don't know already based on the job description that they sent you, but I would ask that. What is the capacity of this job, the expectations, the requirements, and what's the relationship with the CRO and the sponsor? Okay. That will help guide you a lot in terms of what they're expecting and and should help you in what you need to tell them to have them hire you. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your experience. I see you have a lot of lab work here, so like a lab tech 2, a specimen processor, a lead phlebotomist, and so forth. Was all of this done under the scope of a clinical trial that these job functions were a part of?
I believe in capacity, yes. For instance, where I originally started out at a plasmapheresis center, so obviously the plasma was used to make clotting factors for patients, underneath that company, and they also conducted trials with the medication. So I was just under the manufacturing part of it, and then I got an idea of how quality assurance played into that role,
mm-hmm.
and understanding how to do in-house audit and maintenance of training of the phlebotomist or the lab specialist there. So I carried that with me into I don't know if they're around anymore, but as a lead phlebotomist technician at another company where I could be kind of more my own supervisor. So
mm-hmm.
I was pretty much an in-house phlebotomist for a couple of places, particularly Southwest Arthritis Group. The principal investigator of the exhibition there, I was able to see patients, and I actually now it reminds me, I met a monitor there for that at the time, like this was years ago, and I was kind of fascinated with what the monitor was doing. So they were pretty much, describing what you said, making sure that the patient's paperwork, enrollment was correct, and then everything was up to par, considering the study and whatnot. So,
okay, well, that's really good.
Yeah, so that's just the background there. And then the hospital, one of the hospitals here in Dallas, obviously they're really big with research. So just kind of learning how to take all of my skills and apply them in an environment where it's fast-paced and it's obviously a huge research staple here in Dallas, Texas. So yeah, that's kind of where it all accumulated.
Okay.
So in-house, hospital, outpatient, so a variety, clinic, specialist, encompasses there.
Okay, so it sounds like at least you've been exposed to clinical research trials, you worked with the staff. Did you process the samples for the patients, or did you draw blood for the patients?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I drew blood, processed samples, kept samples, also familiar with reference labs. One of the hospitals, they had contracts with, the big labs here at Quest and other LabCorp. So a lot of reference tests, especially working at UT Southwestern, I was able to see a broader scope. And the processing area, you have your chemistry, your micros, and your reference laboratory. So I was able to see it like on a bigger scale. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So the UT Southwestern was really the place where you gained kind of that core experience for the clinical trials.
That's correct.
Okay. So what I would do on your resume, highlight all. You're going to have to tailor this because lab processing is kind of seems, at least from afar, like far away from clinical trials. So what you have to do is in your description of your job duties, bring it into specifics of the clinical trials that you worked on, even listing the types of trials that you've worked on. So, for instance, if you did like a NASH trial, an eczema trial, a PAH trial, whatever indications you were working in, make a separate section in your resume that talks about your clinical trial experience, and it essentially. It's just bullet points in terms of the indications you worked in. So if it was cancer or whatever it is, you want to put that in there. And then put in the type of trial, the specific disease or and also item that the clinical trial was testing. So was it a device? Was it a drug? Was it just blood samples that you guys were collecting for an assay? It could be a number of things. And then also put what phase was it? So, phase 2, 3, 4. And if it was a medical device, put, class 3 medical device, if that's what it was. A class 3 is a device that is important for or needed for, essentially sustaining life. So if it was something, like a very serious condition that required, this medical device, and you were part of the lab team for that, just kind of detail those specifics, because the sponsors and the CROs are going to want to see your clinical trial experience. So what I call that is therapeutic experience, and I'll put that maybe towards the bottom of the resume. And under therapeutic, just bullet point each indication you worked in and essentially what each of those trials were for. Okay. Now, again, back to your experience, though. Speak of it in terms of you're part of the research staff in your writing. Okay, so being a part of the research team, I did, X, Y, and Z. And you want to use some keywords, like did you ever maybe input, well, for instance, when you're processing the blood, did you have to record what you were doing somewhere? Like, for instance, like which blood samples were processed, the time that they were collected, or any other samples that you might have been processing?
Oh, yes. The laboratory, each hospital or each setting has their specific system which they use. So,
right. Did you use Epic?
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay.
Epic, yeah.
Okay. So have another section that's called System Experience, and you're going to want to put the EMRs that you worked in. So put Epic and anything else that you worked in. If you used any sort of research-specific systems, such as like a CTMS or an EDC system, then you want to list that as well. If you haven't used those, you're going to want to express your understanding of what those systems are. So do you know what those are by chance?
I'm assuming it has to do with clinical research.
Yes. Okay, so I'll break it down for you. So a CTMS stands for Clinical Trial Management System. What that is essentially, not every site will have one of these, but a lot of them do. So the CTMS is a tool, like a software tool, that allows the research sites, and also sponsors, but sponsors use it on a different level. It allows the research site to manage their trials and their patients. So it'll have everything in there from the patient visits, it'll schedule patients for them, it'll remind patients of their visits, it'll allow you to input the data from the visits into that system, and it'll keep track of budgets and billing and all those things. So that's essentially what a CTMS is, and where the data comes from is called source documentation. So that's another keyword. And when you collect data from whatever blood samples you're processing or other biological specimens that you're processing in the lab, all that you're recording is going on source documentation. Okay, even if it's going into the EMR, the study team is going to use that for the clinical trial. Okay, so in your resume, you're going to want to put recorded the source documentation for these samples, or however you want to word that. Okay, and then you can put experience with CTMS and EDCs, because all that data is going to be used for that. But when they ask you about it in the interview, you're going to have to be able to relay what those systems are. Okay, so the CTMS, like I said, is used to manage the patients, the trials, the billing, the scheduling for the protocol. Because when a patient is in a trial, they have to follow a specific schedule as to when they're going to come in, right?
Yeah.
So that's what the CTMS tracks, essentially, and it collects all the data for each visit. So be sure to be able to explain that during this interview, as well as what an EDC system is. So an EDC is an electronic data capture system. That can also be called an ECRF, electronic case report form. Clinical research is all about acronyms, so you got to just be able to memorize them, because they will talk to you in these acronyms, and if you don't know what something is, it's going to tell them that you don't know, right? So the EDC is used by the sponsors and the sites, but is controlled by the sponsor or the CRO where you're going to. So the EDC is used to essentially collect all of the data. So the site will record data on their source documentation. That source documentation may be on paper, it may be in their CTMS, it may be in Epic, right? Now, Epic is used for clinical trials, so it's good that you put Epic on there because a lot of hospitals use it when they're in studies. But essentially, the data that comes from there goes into the EDC system, and the sponsors review that with their medical affairs team, their biostatisticians, and the project managers and CRAs. They all review this data and make sure that it is, that the visits are conducted on time, that they're conducted in accordance to the protocol, that they're all within, the windows that the protocol allows for each visit. That's what this does, and it they'll send out queries to the sites like, hey, this doesn't make sense, can you clarify, or can you make an edit to this entry because it's inaccurate, based on the monitors going to the site and finding in the source documentation that this didn't match, right? So that's kind of what this is for. It's essentially just just making sure that it's all in line with each other in terms of what's on the source and what's in the EDC system. Okay? And being able to express this to them, it shows your understanding, at least, of the role and of the systems. Okay? Now, the other system is an eTMF system, and that's an electronic trial master file. Okay? And they'll just say eTMF. That's used by the sponsors, and sometimes they'll give access to the site, sometimes they won't. So if you don't have experience with an eTMF, don't worry, just because a lot of the times sites don't have access to them. Okay? But it's good that you understand what it is, because if they talk to you about it, you got to be able to carry a conversation about it. So an eTMF is, it's essentially like a regulatory binder. So for each study, you have a reg binder, and you could have a pharmacy binder or some other binder if it's a device trial to keep track of the devices. The reg binder is essentially, it holds the protocol, the IRB approvals, the medical licenses, the training certificates, the consent forms, any correspondence with the sponsors, and so forth. It's essentially everything for the clinical trial is in there. And logs, so to keep track of like screening logs, enrollment logs, temperature logs, things like that. They're all inside the reg binder. So that reg binder is essentially the equivalent of an eTMF. The eTMF will have all of that information inside of it. And that's what the sponsor uses to keep track of their sites, because they need to make sure that the sites don't lapse in the IRB approval, that their medical licenses are all current, that their CVs are current, that their trainings are current, and that's what this eTMF is for. Okay? Also, the eTMF will keep track of the patients that are enrolled in terms of any sort of paperwork that you need to save per patient. So, for instance, if there's note to files that are called, here's another acronym, NTF. So, note to files are made if they need to make some sort of correction to something. Like, let's say they did something wrong in a visit, they would write a note to file saying kind of what went wrong and why, and how they're going to prevent it from happening again, right? And so those kinds of documentations, any sort of like medical history things, will be in the eTMF for each of those patients that are enrolled. Okay? So that's kind of a breakdown of those systems for you. I know it's a lot, but it would be really great if you just look up some of these names. That way you get some visual aids as to what they might look like, and you'll be able to become more familiar with them. Okay. Now, again, we'll go back to your experience. Just everything that you write down, like I said, make it in the scope of the clinical trial. That way, the hiring manager, when reading it, they're not going to just see, oh, why are you a lab tech and a specimen processor? How does this relate to being a CRA, right? So you're going to have to tailor this to it, and you're going to have to sell yourself during these interviews. because you have to really drive home the point that you understand this role, you know what's expected, and you can do it, right, based on your past experience and your current knowledge. Now again, don't get disappointed if they say no, because you will always get more no's than you do yeses. Okay, that is the golden rule. Okay, so don't get discouraged. It's a learning experience. Every single time you go to one of these, it's gonna teach you something. It's gonna teach you what you did wrong. It's gonna teach you what you did right. It's gonna show you how you can improve on the next one. And it's really all about how you're selling yourself, what you're saying. Okay, so one really key thing, and this can go to my viewers as well. One really key thing is called persuasion, and this is a sales tactic. Okay, so persuasion is where you're setting up your prospect to think in a certain way. Okay, so that your sales pitch essentially can be at least lined up for success. So one really great thing to do when you sit down with them and before they get a chance to ask you questions, is you ask them, what was it about you that they liked, what was the reason why they called you in? What did they like about you? And when they start elaborating on this, it's automatically putting them in the mindset to think positively about you. It's reminding them why they liked you, right? Okay, so now when they say these things to you as to, oh, I like this about you, I like that about you, this experience was interesting to me, can you tell me more about it? When they tell you these things, start elaborating on each of those things. That way you're just focused on all the positive things about you, and it doesn't give them an opportunity to start thinking about what you don't know. Does that make sense? Now, it's also really great to say things like, let's say at the very end of this, after you've kind of brought them down this path of positivity about you and reminding them why they chose you, right? You can then kind of bring it into a place where it's like, based on my past experiences, as well as my current knowledge on the industry, I felt like I was a great match for this role, and that's why I wanted to come in. And I think based on what you're telling me, I think you feel the same way, isn't that right? If you say it like that, you're automatically going to put them in a mindset to want to agree with you. Okay, so that's a really great way to kind of close it. And now during these interviews, they're going to be cycling you through a bunch of people. So you might see like 2, 3, 4, 5 different people. Okay, it's good to keep the narrative the same, but that persuasion question though should only be directed to the hiring manager, because the hiring manager is the one that brought you in. Okay, so if they have you talking to some of their subordinates did not bring you in, right? So just keep that question just for the hiring manager. I've talked a lot. So what, I guess, concerns do you have, or worries, or anything like that I can help you with?
Okay. Yes, it was really important to note that the terms will be utilized. So it's good that I know these, so I can do my research. As well, I have an idea that they would ask me scenario questions. Granted that I have limited or there's no experience in this role.
Yeah.
How would you say for me to use my experience to kind of give an idea of what I presume that would be the correct response in that given situation?
For a scenario type question? So,
yeah,
and this brings me back to the positivity, right? So when you're talking to them about the positive things about you that they liked, this will hopefully steer them away from asking those harder questions. Okay, but if they do ask those questions regardless, it'll be good to understand again the role. So pretty much with the CRA, they are in charge of managing the site and making sure the site stays in compliance with the FDA, the IRBs, and the sponsor and the protocol. Okay, so the CRA, when they first start a new project, a new study, they're going to have to sit down with the project manager and kind of learn the trial, learn what's been going on, kind of get caught up, right? So they're going to then have a bunch of sites assigned to them, and these sites will be across the country or it could be global. And each of those sites are in a different stage. Some are going to be enrolling, some haven't been activated yet, some are in contract and budget negotiations, some have been activated but haven't enrolled, they've just been stagnant. So the CRA's job is to really keep track of what's going on at each of these sites. So really your first thing to do would be to call each site and just kind of do an introductory call and introduce yourself, get caught up on maybe any issues that they're having, and just take notes for each of those sites. Okay. Then every single day, every single week, you're going to have to keep up with what's needed for them. So that goes into the systems because there's things called trackers. And trackers keep track of the status of sites and a number of other things. And these are typically Excel spreadsheets, which are really horrible. But some sponsors are really sophisticated and they'll use much more sophisticated trackers. Okay, so the trackers will say, okay, for this staff member, we're missing these trainings or these certificates or whatever it may be. So that person can't be activated on the trial yet. This other person has everything, so he's activated and so forth, right? So that's on a personnel level. Then you have the site level. Okay, the site is missing the contract. Or the contract is in route for signatures, or the budget just got completed, but the device purchasing agreement is still in negotiations. So you're gonna have to keep track on site level things like that. Like, do they have IRB approval? Has the ICF been approved? Another key thing to keep in mind is the ICF checklist. So that checklist is to make sure that the ICF has all the elements of informed consent that's required by the FDA. And those are all the rules that sponsors abide by to make sure that they are in compliance with FDA and that all of their sites are in compliance. Okay, so understanding the function of the CRA is going to help you answer those questions, because the CRA has to work with the monitors when they go to the sites to monitor the sites. They'll have to essentially produce pending items list, which tells the monitor what's needed at the site. What's missing, what's expired, what needs to be collected. They'll also work with medical affairs. Medical affairs is part of the approval process for patients. So when a patient is being enrolled, they have to go through a screening process. And medical history needs to be reviewed. If there's imaging such as MRIs or so forth, that all needs to be reviewed. And the medical affairs team is there to review those items along with any sort of national PIs that the sponsor or CRO are working with. The national PIs are essentially the big overseeing principal investigators for the trials. Okay, so essentially the CRA works with all these people to make sure that everything's in line. So when they ask you situational type questions like, what would you do in a situation where, it could be anything, a site is out of line with the protocol, then you would have to say, well, I would look in the protocol and see what defines a minor deviation and a major deviation, and then notify the site of the proper action from that point, right? So if it's a minor deviation, they just might need to do a note to file. They'll need to make sure that if a patient is out a window, that the patient is seen, that all the procedures are done in accordance to the protocol, and that all that is noted in the site's source documentation. Okay. If it's a major deviation, that would be like they committed fraud and they enrolled a fake patient. Then at that point, you'll need to notify your project manager, your director, your monitors, and the monitor is going to have to go out there and confirm, okay, this is fraud, and then they'll have to then report that to the FDA and so forth, right? So there's different ways to keep track of these things and to manage them. And understanding the role is what's going to help you answer those situational type questions.
Yes. And tying into the role, so let's say the opportunity is presented and presented, and sort of the training aspect of the role. What would you say is like the general
Yeah, so every company is going to work a little bit different in that regard. So I'll give you an example. My first sponsored job, the training there was really elaborate. They sat down with you with different groups of people to go over different things. So they would even train you like on some really basic things like what is a CTA, which is the contract. What's an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement. What's in a budget. And then they'll go over things like, essentially like here's the protocol timeline. Here's the table of events for the protocol and so forth. And they'll explain what the trial is. They'll explain a lot of the job functionality, and that might go over the course of a month, right? Now, those sponsors are ones that are known for hiring people that are a little green, and maybe even fresh out of college, right? So those sponsors dedicate a lot more time to training. Other sponsors are expecting you to know everything, and all they're going to do is train you on the study, and they're going to expect you to know how to do everything else, right? They're training on the systems. They're training you on essentially who to talk to for what. They'll train you on how to use certain things that they use, but they're not going to train you how to do the job, right? So it depends where you're going. The CRO, I'm not familiar with the CRO that you're applying to, but CROs are typically pretty harsh on their employees in terms of the working hours. So the reason being is, for instance, a sponsor is typically concerned with staying in compliance, collecting quality data, making sure everything's clean and tidy for the FDA, and that's what they're focused on, right? A CRO is focused on, okay, we have this client that we need to perform for and we need to bill for, right? So the CRO is all about billable hours. So it's a different mindset between the two organizations. So since the CRO is on billable hours, they will be expecting their CRAs to essentially always be doing something that's billable, right? And they're going to essentially keep you, like, track you like a hawk, right? Like where do you, like, how long were you on this? That's too long, or that's not long enough, and so forth. Okay, so now the CRO might not train you, or they might also train you. It just depends on the company. Okay, so it could be an elaborate training, it could be a really short training. Are you also willing to relocate, or are you trying to stay in Texas?
Relocating is a possibility. I kind of have an idea of the requirement of travel. I don't know if that's different with being an in-house CRA or
Yeah.
still.
Yeah, so the travel varies. So for instance, in my position, I do travel, but it's pretty limited. It's not a lot of travel. I might travel maybe like once a month or so. But other in-house teams don't travel at all. So it just depends how they're utilized. The roles are a little bit different. Some will have you just do like really focused work as a CRA, like all you're doing is this kind of thing. And other companies will kind of broaden that role. And it just depends how they use you. So if you're willing to relocate, California is really where it's at for clinical research. San Francisco, the OC, which is Irvine, and San Diego. These are all the research cities. Okay, so there's nothing but biotech and pharmaceutical companies at all these places. So if you do relocate, many times they'll cover your relocation costs, which is good. And also they like people that are willing to relocate. That's always a plus. And the reason why I'm asking as well is because I know that Edwards Life Sciences does a lot of training. So that would be a company to look into because they are willing to hire people that are new to this industry.
You said Edwards Life?
Yeah, Edwards Life Sciences. So they are a biotech company. I highly recommend them for anyone that's new to this role. And they hire really experienced people as well as people that are fresh out of college, and it depends on the role that they're putting you into as to how they determine this, and also your experience. If you have relevant education and maybe some volunteer experience for like those newly graduated people, they might bring those people on to like a CTA role. And that's what I was talking to you about before. So the CRA role might be a little bit difficult for you to sell right now, right? But a really good way to get into it is through that CTA role, and Edwards Life Sciences has a great, essentially a program to get people in there.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so I would recommend that. We would essentially be neighbors if you come over here, but you know, it's a great company. It's really fun there. You get to learn a lot. It's one of the largest companies, if not the largest company out here. It's like a college campus when you go in there. It's crazy. But it's a great place to learn from. So I would highly recommend that. I would apply for the CTA roles. That will help you get you in the door. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about the CTA role. So the CTAs, at least at that company, you're purely working in the eTMF system, which is called VivoVault. That's the company. So look them up, become familiar with them if you're going to apply. But you're working primarily in the eTMF system, and you are helping the CRAs with filing all the documentation that comes in for all the sites. Okay, and you might run reports for them, and you'll help remind them as to like what needs review, because when documents come in, they have to be reviewed by the CRA and approved in the system as being accurate and correct and everything, right? So that's what this CTAs do, and Edwards does do a good job. If you want to become a CRA, you can ask them, you know, can I have more CRA duties, and that way it kind of helps you with the promotion process. Now with Edwards, you're going to be hired as a contractor at first, which means it's like a third party that's hiring you. That third party is the one you actually work for and is paid by, and then you're just essentially allowed to sit at Edwards and work there. Now, the goal is to get converted into full-time, and I've seen people do it in about a year's time. I've also seen people take like years to do it, and I think it just depends on how ambitious you are, how good you are at your job, and how good you are at expressing what you want, and all of that. You know, that's the kind of playing field that you're in. Now, Edwards is also a massive company, so it's hard to get noticed, right? There's like 10,000 people there. But it's a great way to get your foot in the door, and it's a great name to have on your resume. The names are a huge part of it. People will hire you because you worked there. You know what I'm saying? So that is really the kind of clout that you want, because it's going to help you tremendously in your career, not just in education wise, but also in getting other jobs, because you're now reputable in the industry by working with them. Now, Edwards may not pay for your relocation, or they also might. It just depends. But that's something you want to at least say that you're open to doing, and then you can always ask if they're able to help or cover the relocation costs. Now, the recruiting agency might do it because recruiters make money off of you. So they take a percentage of your pay, essentially. You won't ever see that percentage taken out, but your pay will always be lower than if you were hired directly, and it's because the agency is taking money. Now, they are motivated because of that to get you hired, right? So they might pay for your relocation costs. But look up Edwards Life Sciences, watch YouTube videos about them. They do a lot of PR. Look up VivoVault, because that's the main system that they use. Also, watch my video on the interview questions about the CRA. That'll help you a lot too. Did you watch that one?
I think I did come across it, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just review it again, because I go over a lot of the kind of detailed questions, and I think a lot of what I told you today will help connect what I'm saying there with your specific experience here.
Yeah, I definitely have like 2 pages of notes right now.
Okay. I know I said a lot. It's a lot to know, but honestly, the role is not hard. It's kind of like once you understand how it all works, it's not a difficult job. It sounds like a lot because there's a lot of acronyms to know. There's a lot of moving parts to understand. There's a lot of people involved. But once you really understand, it's really the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so when you go from job to job to job, or you go from study to study, you'll see that it's just the same thing. It's just a different study. It's just a different company. It's just it's all very repetitive once you understand the process.
So, looking at my resume, is there anything as far as the job experience that she, leave off, or?
Yeah. So.
Just kind of implement.
So anything like you said prepare specimens for protocol for reference laboratories. That's good because you're mentioning protocol, but you're going to want to be maybe a little bit more specific. What types of specimens. What disease was this for? And when you use laboratories, you want to use the term like central lab or local lab because that's the language of like a sponsor. So like a local lab is the lab you would use that the hospital always uses. The central lab would be a lab that the sponsor says, okay, all your specimens for this project go to that lab. Okay. So, so things like that. You need to tailor this around trials. So you put here, verify accuracy of data entry. Data entry is great. That's a word to use. But you're going to want to say, data entry for the EDC, data entry for source documentation, things like that. Just like we were going over. You use the term like protocol timelines because, like I said, there's visits that need to occur within certain windows. So you would have to make sure that the blood was drawn or whatever sample was collected within that window for each visit. Yeah. Right. So talk in terms like that, and that should help you a lot with writing this. It might also be a good idea to put like in your title, clinical research lab tech, clinical research specimen processor, things like that. Like that way it's kind of just tailoring your title and your job description around research so that when someone glances at this, they're going to think research, not a lab. That's essentially what you're trying to do. Think, when they look at this, you want them to think research, not a lab. Okay, that's going to help them understand how you fit the role. But I would highly recommend a CTA position to start and to get trained on. And Edwards is a great company if you're able to relocate.
Okay, you said what part of California are they located?
They are in Irvine, in Orange County.
So yeah, basically, just from the last position to now, I just decided to go back to complete my degree, so that way I have like a solid educational background as far as
you have a bachelor's in biology, which is great. That's fantastic, and that's what they're looking for as well. They're looking for that past experience. Have you ever been trained on GCP, which is good clinical practices?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Definitely, a lot of my I don't want to be generous, but like just any type of quality, I really picked up on working at a plasmapheresis center, like from screening donors to actually going to headquarters and seeing production, and I really learned like from the ground up an idea of clinical research, like just one of many things. So just being able to be on this end is really kind of appealing to me. Like I was trying to decide on whether to further as a mid-level provider, but I just always have interest in research, whether it be from doing it in the laboratory setting or from protocols and just structure and just attention to detail. So this is one position I've considered, but I've never really felt the preparedness to apply for. But the CTA role is really appealing. So I'll definitely look into that. And while we're talking about certificates, in your resume you need to have a certificate section. This is gonna. Oh, I see you have it there. Okay, perfect. So BLS. Now in there, put GCP training, and then also I imagine you had IATA training. Is that correct? So IATA training, you can look it up as well. That is usually always required for a phlebotomist to have when they're drawing blood for a clinical trial. So you probably had it, and if not, you might have had an equivalent of one, right? So just look up what it is so that you understand, and then I'm sure you had some sort of training associated to that, and make sure you have that in there. And then also, in reference to the IRB, I've had training in that, like doing some lab undergrad research.
Great. Great. Put that in
So
there.
I should probably
Put that in
put
there.
that on there.
Any sort of auditing experience, put it in there. IRB experience. IRB is called a regulatory experience in the sponsor world.
Yeah.
So don't get tripped up when they say regulatory. And it's even tricky for me because I many times just call it just IRB. I never refer to it as regulatory. So even when people tell me regulatory, I sometimes have to think about it. So just don't get that. Don't let that just trip you up. But yeah, certificates are important. IRB experience is important. Auditing is important. System experience is important, and working on different types of indications are important. So whatever types of trials you worked on, whatever diseases they were for, whatever devices or drugs that they were looking at, all that has to be listed in here. And again, write the phases, 2, 3, or 4, or 1 if you did a phase 1. Write down if they were global or not. It tells them a lot about your experience when you say things like that. So look at my video for resume development. That goes over all these really specific things. And then look at my video for the interview questions. That should help you a lot. Just review the whole playlist for the CRA, becoming a CRA. Because that's going to really go over all these really, really fine points so that while you're writing your resume, you can really apply what I'm saying in those to what you're doing.
Thanks again for taking the time and
Yeah,
just
not a problem.
structuring the role for me and breaking down my resume. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, you know what? This is why I created this channel. I wanted to help people. When I was doing this, I have a long experience in clinical research, but when I kind of started going into the sponsor realm, it was all new to me, right? Because it's a different perspective. It's a different job function. It's the same thing, but it's like you're on the other side of the fence kind of thing, right? So I had to learn a lot about what they want to hear, what they don't want to hear. I had to learn a lot about how to make my experience match what they're looking for, and it was that information that didn't exist, which kind of brought me to the point of making this channel, because I wanted to be able to put that information out there, educate people, because it's not that hard once you get the hang of it. And all I needed was someone to tell me, but there was no one there, right? So I feel like if I can be that person for others, then it should help a lot of people to do this.
Oh, and I have another question for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
What keeps you from not getting burnt out? Because I did do a little search on, like you said, some of these CROs.
Yeah.
Burn out their employees.
Absolutely.
So for you, how did you kind of just cater it to where you're still finding the passion to do what you're continually doing? Yeah,
well, for me, it's a little bit different because I view everything from an entrepreneurial mindset. So, for instance, what I'm doing now was the part of the experience that I didn't have before, right? And so I'm viewing this more as a, further development of my skill set, a deeper knowledge of the industry so that I can apply it to other things that I want to do, right? So different consulting ventures, different business ideas that I have, that's what kind of keeps me going. Just because I'm using it as a tool to further advance in other ways, right? So I think it's finding what motivates you and what drives you, and applying this job to help you in that way, right? So whatever it is that you want to get to, if you want to become a project manager or director, or you want to go into sales for pharmaceuticals or whatever it is, everything that you're doing in this position, do it in a way that's going to get you to your goal, right? And that should help you be motivated. And, other questions will come about, of course, and you can always feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Eric, for your time again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you putting, your faith in me and your trust in me for this call. So thank you. And, like I said, feel free to reach out. Good luck on your interview. Let me know how it goes, okay?
Definitely. Have a wonderful weekend.
All right, you too. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
So that's it, guys. That's how a coaching call goes. I hope this helps her. I hope this helps anyone else out there with upcoming job interviews. And if anyone wants to be on here, be sure to message me with your situation. I'll be happy to have you on a call for my channel. Okay, so take care, guys.